Welcome back to the Life Well Led podcast. My name is Karen Ladaney. I am a strategy and mindset coach. And here with me is my wonderful co-host, Mr. Eric Hebschel.
Hello.
Who is a wonderful leadership and executive coach.
Oh, you're too kind. Thank you.
Okay, Eric, I was thinking about this week's topic, which is getting comfortable being uncomfortable.
Oh, I like that.
So as I was going through kind of thinking about this topic, this quote stood out to me. I was death scrolling on Instagram and I saw this Adam Grant quote pop up. And the quote was about ghosting.
Okay.
And it said, ghosting isn't always due to a lack of care. It's often a misguided effort to avoid hurting someone. Or maybe feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's more what I think it is. I think Adam Grant's halfway there. I think some people on the other side of ghosting think that they're not being considered or, being chastised or just simply not being, valued. But on the other end of it, it's really, you're not taking that into consideration nearly as much. More likely, as much as you don't want to hurt the person, you're probably just saying, this is an uncomfortable conversation, so we're just not going to have it, and just pretend that they don't exist.
Exactly. It's that avoidance that we put up in our brains, like, if it's out of sight, out of mind, I don't have to think about it.
Yeah, heads in the sand like an ostrich. That seems to be very common these days. People ghost quite a bit, whether it be, on a job or relationships. It's so easy to do. And, you wonder why. And to your point, people don't like being uncomfortable.
Yeah. Why don't people like being uncomfortable? I mean, obviously there's reasons why, but I think let's dive into the heart of it. What is so uncomfortable about being uncomfortable?
Well, I think it's just part of human nature. Being uncomfortable is something that we try to not do. When we grow up as babies, you touch a hot stove, you get burnt. You hop into something cold, you freeze. So yeah, there's pain associated to that, but sometimes it's just loss. Yeah. Sometimes you get hurt over something that you say or do. And so being uncomfortable leads to just this innate urge to not be that way. It's very easy to be uncomfortable and get back to your comfort zone. And it's a muscle you have to work to get there. I can speak from that from experience and what I've read as well. So I think it's just easy because it's in our nature to try to be as comfortable as possible and try not to be hurt or try to associate ourselves with a loss.
Yeah, I agree. I think it does. I think change equals loss. I think we are so afraid of change in a lot of ways because change is loss and we're fearful of that loss.
It depends though, because there's a lot of change that people would say, hey, $1 million tomorrow. I have no problem with that change. Some people in theory say, I want to have a change in our environment, a change in our social system. That sounds all great. But when the actual work comes along and you have to say that there's a loss involved, that's where I think people start to realize that it's not the fear of change, it's the fear of loss. And I think that even though they may not be able to see that right away, those who actually advocate for change may back off because of the losses involved.
But the truth is, though, every change, discomfortable or comfortable, leads to growth.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I mean, that's how you get there. That's how you bridge the gap is in order to grow, you need to change because the system, we've talked about this before, the system that you have currently is set up to give you the results that you have. And if you're not happy with the results that you have to change the system. And you're right. I think change does equal loss in some ways. And that's what makes us fearful of the conflict that we need to deal with in order to get to the growth.
Well, look at our just take it from a biology perspective and from an evolutionary standpoint, right? As we have grown as human beings from where we started to where we are today, all of that is to say that we had to evolve. We had to lose some things. Where we came from a caveman, I'm assuming we didn't have to have fur all over us anymore. So we shed that. We have a more upright posture. We have maybe a little less muscle because we're not necessarily working outside all the time, but we've crafted our brains and intellect. So long story short is that we've evolved over time by losing certain things and gaining things in return because we have thought, this is huge because obviously we don't have control over our evolutionary track, but individually we do. We absolutely do. So you have to think about it from an evolutionary standpoint. You are growing, but you have to be aware that you're going to have to shed some of the stuff that doesn't work in order to gain stuff that will work.
So when I think of discomfort, I think of really, it comes down to conflict. And really there's two types of conflict. The first conflict is that internal conflict. the issues that you're having within that are stopping you from achieving what you truly want. And a lot of times this looks like self-sabotage, and it comes in the form of internal triggers of sadness and stress, self-doubt, a lot of self-doubt, maybe even boredom, or safeties like wanting to feel comfortable or wanting to feel safe, or these emotions that we like to fit into, that we use as safe harbors even though they might be holding us back. I feel like that's the internal conflict side. And then there's that external conflict side, and that's the conflict with others. And that you can definitely feel is uncomfortable. You know you have to say something or you should say something, but you don't. Or you have this hesitancy to say something. And I think, and now jump in, but I
Mm-hmm.
really think that this external conflict, this conflict with others, comes from us having expectations of others or others having expectations of us, and we feel like we are not meeting those expectations, or vice versa.
It's the perception that we have expectations
Yeah.
of others, right? Not that we have expectations of others. That's true, but we have the perception that others have expectations of us. That's what I mean to say. And that's absolutely true, but that's an assumption, it's an interpretation,
Yeah.
and that's not necessarily always true. So, yeah, I mean, that one's pretty easy. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to identify in the moment, but you can definitely feel the uncomfortable from the external conflict that is created. But back to the internal conflict, how obvious is that for some people? I don't think it's that obvious.
Well, I think it can be. I think a lot of times it does come in the form of self-sabotage. We stop ourselves from actually achieving what we want because we feel
Okay.
like we don't deserve it, or we haven't worked hard enough for it. Or, I mean, in our coaching terms, those are called gremlins. Those are like the negative, nasty thoughts that are built into us. When we look in the mirror, we say, we're not good enough for this. We don't deserve that. We're not worthy. I'm not smart enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not take your put your adjective
Blank enough,
yeah,
yeah.
put your adjective in there, and then enough. I think that's a lot of the internal conflict that we deal with, and almost every single coaching issue comes back to some sort of gremlin, some sort of I'm not good enough.
True. It's about, first of all, finding whatever is blocking you from getting there. And that's what the internal conflict ends up being, is not just self-sabotage, but also, well, I guess it is self-sabotage at the
Yeah.
end of the day, right? It's something that's blocking you that you may be conscious of or not, but it takes either a good coach or your own self-work and self-time, good therapist, whatever it might be, to really come to the realization that this is getting in my way, and how do I actually resolve that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of it is, like you said, coming to a realization, and there's kind of a formula to it. So, Eric, I'm curious if you could share an example of when maybe you felt self-sabotaging, because
Oh, yeah.
I certainly have self-sabotaged myself
We all have.
all the time.
We all have, and I still can to this day. I mean,
Yeah.
one good example in my career was I actually had an opportunity to take advantage of a promotion for a new role with new responsibilities. I was very excited about the idea, and then once I actually started looking at the details of what the day-to-day life was, self-sabotage kicked in. I basically said, I am not good enough to do this. I am happy enough doing what I am currently doing because I do it well. I don't have a guarantee that I will do this well. Therefore, I am afraid, and therefore I am not good enough. And so I backed off after basically accepting it for the first 2 days. So that was not fun. But I did learn that had I accepted it, I might have had a better chance of being happy, because in the long run, I was not happy in the position that I was in. And I kind of knew that, because that's why I wanted it and I was excited about it. But it didn't really come to fruition after another 8 months to say, wow, this is not good. I am not enjoying where I am currently. So I took that chance again outside the company with a different position, with different responsibilities. And while I didn't get that particular position, the company still hired me to do something with a whole new set of roles and responsibilities for higher pay. So, I learned that lesson from there, is that you have to take a chance on yourself, and you have to be able to say, are you going to be miserable here and this is comfortable? Well, it still sucks. So comfortable is not really helping me.
Yeah.
Or do I want to be uncomfortable for a little bit of time, which may have been a month or two, and then go into it and figure out, wow, this is actually for me.
Okay, so let's break this down. So what I'm hearing you say is, after learning about the role, you thought that you were going to be too uncomfortable. You retreated back to your safety zone
Yep.
and you figured that it wasn't worth the risk of going into the unknown. You would rather be comfortable. So
Right.
by not advocating for yourself or not taking the risk, you valued comfort and safety over what could be.
Right. And that was my part of the
Yeah.
mess, was just valuing comfort and safety in a moment where I could have realized that it was a better opportunity to move forward. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
So,
I
but
caved into it.
yeah, it's so interesting. But then you came to this realization, and that's part of the process. Is you come to a realization where you realize that taking the risk is better than being in a joyless job or not feeling fulfilled in your
Right.
current position. And that is what sparks action.
Well, that's part of the system, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is true of a company system, but the individual system, your own system, the cyclical cycle of I am miserable, but I am comfortable. I am miserable, but I am comfortable. Well, something is not working. It's
Right.
working for my sense of I want to feel comfortable and safe, but it's not making me happy overall. So I got to get that part out of the way and move forward to take a chance on, all right, what experiment can I try to get myself
Yeah.
out of this? And so I did that. It was a big experiment, not necessarily small,
Yeah.
but I got the position that I wanted. And for a short, I mean, a couple years, almost a couple years, it worked out well for me.
Yeah. That's amazing. I mean, that's amazing that you were able to come to that realization, take the action that created massive change. So by getting uncomfortable, you were able to create this new experience in your life that worked out really well for you for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it was a leap of faith in the new position, but I took it on and ended up getting bored with that too. So sorry, but at least that was a
That's
good
life,
challenge. Well, that's
right? I
exactly it.
mean,
It was a challenge.
life is ever evolving.
It made its way through the way that it needed.
I think a lot of people struggle with internal conflict,
Oh
right? I think
yeah.
almost every issue comes back to I'm not good enough, or I'm afraid to do this, or I'm afraid to upset this person, or this person thinks of me in this way and I'm not living up to that expectation in some way. I mean, what the example that comes to mind all the time are the daughter mother-in-law kind of situation where the mother-in-law has these expectations of their daughter-in-law, and you just see this play out in Hollywood all the time in every rom-com you've ever seen about marriage,
Mhm.
where there's this expectation and this conflict. And I think that's where you get the internal conflict but also the external conflict, and so many people avoid external conflict.
I think that having conflict in any relationship is how you move things forward, because
Yeah.
I mean, this is not just personal, professionally as well. Like companies, people avoid conflict like the plague. That's why you have HR departments that just get
Yeah.
in the way and say, hey, you did something. What did I do? Well, we can't really tell you. Oh, okay. Well, I get that there's some rules and laws around that, but it actually feeds this inability to have a good, healthy, productive conflict where you say, hey, the way we're doing things right now isn't working. Or what is our intended result by doing this? And that makes people uncomfortable. They're not trying to have people shut down or throw fists at you or, God forbid, have an emotional reaction to the point where they just run out of the room or just stay completely silent. But sometimes a good little pause, a good little silence is good. A little bit of an emotional reaction is good as long as people don't get overheated. So healthy conflict is productive conflict.
Well, it's hard not to get our personal emotions caught up in that. When you go
Oh, no
into
doubt.
conflict, it's, usually people are really defensive and angry and combative, and we just don't want to deal with that. So it's easy to avoid conflict. We don't want to be in that just the uncomfortable situation. So we just avoid it altogether, whether we should or not. I mean, I think we don't want to rock the boat, but also there's this line of where do you draw the line between rocking the boat and sacrificing your values and your beliefs. And that's just a tough balancing act.
Well, I think people lost sight of the fact that in order to move forward, you have to be able to accept that the losses will happen, and that means you have to accept that conflict will happen.
Yeah.
You have to believe that as much as you avoid the conflict, those things don't change because the relationship is still in a cyclical cycle of, not being what you want it to be. So, in order to change, you have to have a little bit of conflict.
Yeah.
And so you have to realize that conflict equals change. Now, you may be uncomfortable, but if you have the foresight in mind to say, all right, if we have this uncomfortable conversation, this might lead to something good. Now, it may not lead to where you want it to go, but like you said with your values, if I don't have this conversation, it's going to eat me alive. So, doing what's within your heart, what's within your values, and be able to act on it, that makes a much bigger difference in your soul and your heart than it does if you just sit there and let the relationship continue because you do not want to have that uncomfortable conversation. So, I think it's a great time to talk about this because there's a lot of people that are like that. And hands up, we're all like that, you know?
Yeah.
But I think it's us getting more comfortable with being comfortable and not taking on that uncomfortable leaps of faith that we need to do.
So let's talk about a specific example of external conflict. So, Eric, do you mind sharing maybe an external conflict that you've had that we can kind of outline?
Yeah, real quick, I my parents and my relationship has been good, but not ideal because we live so far away and the communication hasn't been ideal. But health has deteriorated on their side, and I basically had said to myself, "This is not my problem. This is not my responsibility." You know, they can live their life and they can do that, but I also wanted to have a better relationship before, you know, anything bad happens. So, in order to make that change, I had to be uncomfortable and actually address with them, hey,
Mhm.
maybe not necessarily that we have a bad communication, but hey, I need to step in and have a conversation about health. And so, in order to do that, I had to put myself out there. And in doing so, we have a better relationship in the long run. And then there's better care for their health concerns as well. So, yeah, I think that big leap there was to get really uncomfortable, have that conversation where we haven't touched on it maybe ever or very tiptoed around it on eggshells and just dive into it and say, this is what we need to do.
I love this example because you go from this is not my problem, this is their problem, is kind of your initial thought about the situation.
Right.
And then realizing coming to the what is my part of the mess part is tolerating less than in a less than ideal relationship with your
That's right.
parents, right? And which leads to poor communication and all these things. And then the realization of it is if I want a better relationship,
I
then
have to.
I need to change.
Yeah, I mean, it's you can't make them change. You can't make
Exactly.
anybody else on the other side do thing, but you have to start with what you can control, and
Yeah.
then do it with go from your sphere of influence from there. But it starts with you. It starts with your ability to make a change, and if they don't change, that's on them. But at least you put in the effort to make a change.
That is the hardest part because you can't control other people. And this dynamic plays out in so many different ways between personal relationships, romantic relationships, work relationships, where you
Yep.
definitely don't want to say something, but also it's eating you alive, like you said. And so you have to say something. And what can you say? And just put yourself out there and hope that they respond in a way that is receptive and that you hope will get you the result that you want. It's really hard. It is uncomfortable because you just never know how that other person is going to react. Okay, so there is sort of a formula to this that we've been talking through. So I'll figured we'd outline it here if you're interested in this, you find this helpful. So if you're going through conflict, whether it's internal or external, there is that initial thought, the situation. Boil it down to
To the objective fact.
to the objective fact.
Yeah.
So let's use the example of that everybody has had where you've already committed to going to dinner with a friend and now it's 6 o'clock on Friday night and you just don't want to go. Right. So the fact is you've committed to going to dinner.
Right.
Okay. The next part of this is I really don't want to go.
Right.
Right. But you've got to figure out what your part of the mess is. What can you control in this situation? So you've got some options. You can ghost them, not go. You could tell them that you don't want to go, which
Mm-hmm.
is very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Or you could go and sacrifice your freedom, your values, whatever it is, for whatever you maybe you want to do instead. Lay in bed, watch a movie. You're sacrificing that time that you have for yourself to go be with your friend. Those are kind of your three options in this situation.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's probably not a good idea to ghost. I'm sorry. I'm just not going to go with that option. But the other two options is that you could go and, you might be saying, well, I'm doing this for a friend. And, maybe over time that giving
Justifying
back
it.
to
Yeah.
somebody is probably taking away from yourself. So but it could be very much that you love it. Then you end up enjoying it anyway. So there's no right or wrong answer there. But if you say no, and you really know yourself really well to say, I am tired. I've said yes to too many things too many times. It's time to say no. As uncomfortable as that is, you might, or more likely than not, feel better when you say, hey, I'm sorry, I really don't want to go. And as uncomfortable as that is, I guarantee it's not as bad in the result that you're actually going to get versus how you thought it was going to be.
Well, so you've identified what's at least in your control. And then you realize if I change X, then I might influence Y. So let's take the situation of I decide to go and sacrifice my values. If I change my mindset about it, I might be able to convince myself that this is a great thing and I'm going to have a great time tonight. Or on the flip side, if I decide to have that difficult conversation with my friend and tell her that I'm not going to go to dinner tonight, then that is going to create this uncomfortable conversation, but also could potentially get me off the hook. Now I have my free time and she's probably going to be okay with it because we're good friends, blah, blah, whatever the case may be. But you decided, you came to the realization of what you could control and then you acted on it.
Right.
And that is how you get uncomfortable and you get change and you get growth in your relationships. And sometimes choosing the harder thing, you've sacrificed, like, let's go back to that example. You've either sacrificed your free time because of friendship, or you've decided to have the difficult conversation and now you are growing, you're knowing yourself more. Maybe next time you'll be like, hey, guess what? I am not going to commit to that yet.
I've heard this before from somebody else, and I love it. Let your yes be yes and your no be
I
no.
love that.
As easy as that is to say, it's hard to do.
Yeah.
So if you have that uncomfortable conversation and you feel better about it on the other side, start making a change in what your yeses are, which may be fewer than they used to be, and let your no's be plenty and make it be honest, and they can be about, have your boundaries up, and you can say respectfully, I'm not ready to do this, or I just don't have time for this. And maybe we can try another time when I do.
So I think, kind of rounding out this conversation, being comfortable, being uncomfortable means that you have to choose your hard. So let's take Eric's examples. You can feel uncomfortable in a joyless job, or you can feel comfortable in a joyless job, or you can be uncomfortable in the unknown and try something new and adventurous. And maybe it would work out for you and maybe it won't, but you've taken the risk and you've tried it. You can feel frustrated with the relationship as it is and live with it, or you can change how you show up in the relationship and hope that somebody else reciprocates and that you actually see growth and a different result than what you're getting right now. Either way, it's hard. It's hard to live in a joyless job. It's hard to live in a bad relationship that you're unhappy with. It's also really hard to live in the uncomfortable. It's also really hard to have a difficult conversation and show up and be there and be open and be willing to change and grow. Either way, it's hard. So which one's worth it?
Think about it this way: short-term pain, long-term gain. Short-term gain of comfort, long-term pain.
Yeah.
Might make more sense once you actually look at it that way.
Yeah. Remain the same and deal with the current situation, or be willing to take the risky road of change and just see what happens. You never know what will happen.
Choose your hard, folks.